There's something in my eyes.
Greg, hey, wasabi.
Is it wasabi? There's
Is it?
wasabi in my eyes? I've got wasabi in my eyes?
Wait.
Ghastly, with open eyes, he attends, blind.
Hey, so first of all, I want to apologize if I sound weird, or weirder than usual, maybe. That's because I have a cold. I'm getting over a cold anyway. In fact, as I speak, I'm trying not to sneeze. But the content of this video is kind of time sensitive, so I wanted to just record it and get it out before it's completely irrelevant. Anyway, let's talk about Succession. So, a couple of weeks ago, I recorded a video talking about some of the connections between Succession and John Berryman's poetry collection, The Dream Songs. Now, if you're not aware, the titles of every season finale of Succession so far have come from a single poem in this volume, Dream Song number 29. So in that video, I started to dig into the thematic connections that exist between Succession and the Dream Songs. And I promised that I would record more episodes digging into more connections between the series and the poetry collection. And I will do that, but this time around, I want to drill in more specifically on the episode titles themselves and on Dream Song 29 itself, because the official title of the series finale was just announced, and sure enough, it's from Dream Song 29. So the aim of this video is going to be to answer a very simple but also highly speculative question, and that's, can Dream Song 29 tell us anything about what's going to happen in the series finale? And I think maybe it can. If not specific plot points, I think it can give us a little bit of a thematic clue about what's going to happen, and a little bit of a clue above and beyond what you might intuit from just hearing the title. And that title is With Open Eyes. So let's dig in here. First of all, let's talk about the previous season finale titles and how they tie into Dream Song 29. And this isn't just to fill space, because what I discovered as I went back and looked at these episode titles within their context in the poem is that actually the poem provides certainly insight, certainly additional context, but also maybe even spoilers for those episodes, depending on how you read it. So the title of the first season finale is Nobody Is Ever Missing. And that's actually the very final line of the poem. If you were to try to intuit what that line means, what Nobody Is Ever Missing means within the context of the episode, without any knowledge of how it's framed within the poem itself, you might think that it's simply a kind of ironic or sarcastic statement about the state of the Roy family. Given that the episode is about Tom and Shiv's wedding, all the characters are gathered together in one location, and they don't all necessarily want to be there, and they don't all necessarily get along.
I think you need to go fuck yourself.
So you could see it simply as a sort of statement about the tense equilibrium in which this episode occurs, where there's this sort of pervasive, underlying social discomfort between these characters, and yet nobody is missing. Everybody is forced to be there. Everyone's forced to occupy this space together. But if you look at it within the greater context of the poem, it might almost spoil the episode's ending. And let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to read that final stanza, the final stanza of Dream Song 29 that leads up to that line, Nobody Is Ever Missing. But never did Henry, as he thought he did, end anyone, and hacks her body up, and hide the pieces where they may be found. He knows, he went over everyone, and nobody's missing. Often he reckons, in the dawn, them up, nobody is ever missing. So, within the context of the poem, this is a kind of anxious homicidal fantasy on the part of Henry. And Henry, if you didn't watch my previous video, or if you're not familiar with the Dream Songs, is the narrator of all of the poems in the series. He's a kind of proxy or stand-in for John Berryman himself. It's more complicated than that, but let's leave it at that for now.
Somebody quoted me as saying there's a fiendish resemblance between Henry and me.
And so what you have here is this paranoid fear on the part of Henry, the narrator, that at some point he might lose control of himself and murder someone, dismember the body, and hide it. So if you think about what happens at the end of Nobody Is Ever Missing between Kendall and the caterer who he accidentally kills and whose body he leaves at the bottom of a river or a lake. I forget what kind of body of water it was. You know, the kind of mini Chappaquiddick moment. And you compare that to the poem, there's a clear parallel there. And in fact, that parallel goes beyond simply accidentally killing someone or killing someone through a loss of self-control. Note that line, hide the pieces where they may be found. Now, quick aside, I was sure before they announced the actual title of the series finale that it was going to be Hide the Pieces, just because emotionally and thematically that felt so appropriate to the way that the Broken Roy children conduct themselves and deal with their lives. Like, there's this constant, perpetual effort on their part to hide their brokenness, to hide the pieces, to hide the shattered state that Logan has left them with. But I was wrong, so we won't dwell on that. Instead, let's go back to thinking about this in the terms of the first season finale, where the climax and ending of the episode are explicitly about Kendall trying to hide the fact that he's accidentally killed someone. But the poem doesn't just say hide the pieces. The poem says hide the pieces where they may be found, which is exactly what happens in the episode. Kendall is barely finished trying to cover his tracks when Logan reveals that he's entirely aware of everything that happened, and of course leverages it against Kendall to get him to drop his takeover bid. And also the deep irony of the use of that title within the episode, because of course someone is missing. The caterer is dead. He's gone. He's in a car at the bottom of a lake. So he is very much missing the next morning, which kind of speaks to something about the Roy family and the lives that they attach value to and don't attach value to. The idea that, nobody is missing, right? A nobody is missing. Somebody who is in their eyes is a nobody, whose life and death is inconsequential to them, except in Logan's case, maybe as a little bit of leverage, as another piece of capital to be exploited and to be used.
It's good to pay the boy.
No, not that. On our PI, you're the best. Don't beat yourself up. No real person involved.
It's clear then what the connection is between Nobody Is Ever Missing within the context of the poem and the episode Nobody Is Ever Missing. Now, I'm going to skip over the second season finale, This Is Not for Tears, for a really practical reason, and that's because the title of the third season finale, All the Bells Say, occurs almost directly before This Is Not for Tears within Dream Song 29. So, since All the Bells Say comes first, I feel like getting a grasp on how that works within the poem might help us launch into what This Is Not for Tears means. But also, there's a selfish reason for this too, which is I think that This Is Not for Tears is maybe a little more literal in its meaning, and maybe the poem tells us a little less about it. Anyway, All the Bells Say. This title, in and of itself, raises a question, which is, what the hell are the bells saying? It's a question not answered by the title in and of itself. There's maybe some implications you could draw if you just see that title in the context of the episode. Like, it does seem like an omen, right? If you're familiar with bells and the kind of like literary usage and significance of bells, usually if the bells are saying something, it's a kind of prophetic omen, or it's a kind of like underscoring of an importance of a thing. But that doesn't really tell us what the omen might be, or really tell us a huge amount. But of course the poem doesn't end there. We know what the bells say in the poem. To quote here, all the bells say, too late. And that's interesting, because this is another case where the poem kind of gives the game away. Because, of course, the final scene of the season 3 finale is Shiv, Kendall, and Roman arriving, thinking that they're finally about to gain the upper hand on Logan, thinking they finally have leverage over him instead of vice versa, and that they have the power to seize control of Waystar Royco and to block the impending merger, and discovering very quickly that Logan has outmaneuvered them again. And in fact, they're too late. They're too late maybe by minutes, since Logan has presumably just gotten off the phone with their mother, just finished negotiating the deal that screwed them. And so those two hidden words, those two words omitted from the title, tell us something about the episode, maybe spoil the episode a little bit. Maybe if you entered into that episode with what the bells are going to say in mind, you might have been a little bit deflated by the climax. You might have seen the climax coming. And also there's maybe a little additional implication that the central moment of the episode, which is that really unbelievably heartfelt and shockingly heartfelt reconciliation between Kendall and Shiv and Roman, might have also come too late. Certainly it came too late to allow them to seize control of the company or block the merger, but it might also have come too late to provide more than a kind of fleeting moment of catharsis for them, to allow them to fully reconcile and to move forward in a unified and emotionally healthy way. And certainly if the last episode that I've personally seen, America Decides, is any indication, that union between them was not bound to last. So that leaves us with the season 2 finale, This Is Not for Tears. Now, as I said, I'm a little shakier on this one, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, but I will read the line within the context of the poem, and we can see if we can puzzle something out here. So as I said, that comes immediately after All the Bells Say, Too Late. So, all the bells say, too late, this is not for tears, thinking. And that's it. Immediately after that, we get the final stanza, which leads up to Nobody Is Ever Missing, which I already read. So what can we make of this? This is not for tears, semicolon, thinking. So that statement, this is not for tears, is maybe a little relevant to the final scene of the episode, to the choice that Kendall makes at the end of the season 2 finale. Because remember, instead of going forward with the plan to be the Waystar Royco sacrificial lamb for the Cruises debacle, Kendall instead decides to openly betray Logan and to try to use the controversy to maybe redeem himself a little bit, but certainly to finally put what he thinks will be the decisive knife in his father's back, although, of course, that turns out not so much to be the case. And Kendall, throughout season 3, proceeds to royally fuck himself, as he often does. But you can see how This Is Not for Tears might be reflective of the decision that Kendall makes. You know, rather than issuing a tearful apology, rather than taking on the guilt himself, rather than being emotionally open about his own crimes, by the way, he decides to go another path. And that path is a calculated one, a seemingly calculated one, is a conniving one. And so that might play into that one omitted word, thinking. The choice to think and plot and scheme rather than cry, rather than open up and accept the full emotional burden of your culpability. And that's where that semicolon comes in. Because, and this is... and I apologize for getting really English majory on you here. But if that was This Is Not for Tears, comma, thinking, the implication would probably be, it'd be ambiguous, but the implication would probably be This Is Not for Tears are thinking, but the implication also being, but rather something else. But that semicolon indicates that thinking is a new thought, is a fresh thought. So it puts thinking at contrast with tears. It almost presents thinking as a choice made instead of tears, which would make sense within the context of the episode. Its meaning within the context of the poem, I think, is much more deeply ambiguous, and Berryman loves ambiguous phrasing that the reader has to interpret. But we're talking about Succession here. I'm sorry, John. I'm sorry, Berryman, for reducing one of the greatest works of modern English poetry to a, prestige TV theory crafting video. But anyway, that's what I can draw from This Is Not for Tears. So let's finally fucking talk about the series finale title, With Open Eyes. Let's start off by thinking about what conclusions you would draw from that title if you knew nothing about the poem. One thing you might say is, wow, that seems oddly uplifting for Succession. Given that when we think of With Open Eyes, it almost evokes this kind of romantic notion of moving forward without any falseness, without any pretension, without lying to yourself. And within the context of the Roy saga, you might think, oh, maybe the Roy children are finally going to come to terms with the impact that Logan had on them, are finally going to work out their interpersonal problems and move forward in a clear-headed, clear-sighted, maybe even unified, or at least emotionally healthy way. To which you might say once again, that doesn't sound like Succession. And indeed, if you look at it within the context of the poem, the implications are a lot darker. So let me read that stanza. And there's another thing he has in mind. Like a grave Sienese face, 1,000 years would fail to blur the still profiled reproach of. Ghastly, with open eyes, he attends, blind. Yeah, that's a lot bleaker. So let's take this bit by bit. So first, and there's another thing he has in mind. Like a grave Sienese face, 1,000 years would fail to blur the still profiled reproach of. So what's that another thing he has in mind? Well, as I said before, Berryman loves ambiguity. He loves to leave the reader guessing. But if you watched my last video, you might have a guess. And that's that Berryman is talking about the death of his father. And I don't want to go too deep into this. Go watch my previous video, which is all about the way the death of Berryman's father casts this long, dark shadow over the Dream songs, and how that parallels the way that Logan, both alive and dead, has this tremendous oppressive influence on his children. But yeah, it's fair to say that the another thing he has in mind here is his dad. And then if you move on, like a grave Sienese face, 1,000 years would fail to blur the still profiled reproach of. So I could do a whole nother video about the grave Sienese face and what that is within the context of the Dream songs. But TLDR, basically the grave Sienese face, it's a classical painting done in a very particular style that often included depictions of really stern, cold figures. And of course, Succession has its own stern, cold figure, and that's Logan Roy. And then if you move on, 1,000 years would fail to blur the still profiled reproach of. So what you have here is another thing Berryman loves to do, which is this kind of convoluted sentence structure. But what he's really describing here is this painting of this stern-faced, unhappy figure whose expression cannot be eroded by time, or has not been eroded by time. Since it's a painting, and since it's an old painting, there's no chance that the reproachful gaze of this figure is ever going to change. And within the context of Berryman's life and the Dream songs, that is potentially a reference to, once again, the oppressive memory of his father. This grave Sienese face could almost be another depiction of the ghost of Berryman's father kind of existing in his memory, permanently in this kind of miserable state, looking down disapprovingly of his son. And what do you know? That sounds a lot like Logan Roy. And that also sounds a lot like where Logan is at now, existing only as this memory, as this ghost that the Roy children can't exorcise, at least not easily. But then there's the actual sentence where we find the title. Ghastly, with open eyes, he attends, blind. Now, first of all, ghastly, with open eyes, he attends, blind, just taken at face value, gives you a totally different impression than if you just saw the phrase with open eyes. Instead of this kind of moment of clarity, this moment of clear-sighted vision, you get ghastly. You know, that you get an ugly, dark, bleak moment, and a moment of blindness, which is the very fucking opposite of what you think of when you hear the phrase with open eyes. You think of vision, you think of clarity, but here it's with open eyes, blind. So what does that mean for the Roy children? Well, maybe it means the exact opposite of what I suggested before. Maybe it means that there's not going to be any clear reconciliation with Logan's memory, any moment of clarity of any kind, that instead maybe they will continue blindly to repeat these sick emotional and psychological habits that they're stuck in. But also, I've talked a lot in this video about Berryman's love of ambiguous phrasing, and we get that again here. Because who's the he in this sentence? The obvious intuitive answer is, oh, well, it's Henry, because the previous he's, for example, and there is another thing he has in mind, refer directly to Henry. But here, it's less clear, because we just saw the grave Sienese face. We just got the implication that we might be dealing with Henry's father here. So the he who's attending blind could be the father present at Berryman's side as a ghost, blind. You know, incapable of any kind of vision because he's dead. And that interpretation, in fact, is reinforced by the use of the word ghastly here, a word that you often associate with horror, and more specifically with ghosts and with the dead. So the image of someone ghastly being present but blind is very much this kind of spectral image, the image, once again, of the ghost that cannot be exorcised. And what do you know? Logan's presence in the series finale is likely to be exclusively that of a ghost, that of this spectral presence that the Roy children can't free themselves of. So, anyway, I've talked this thing to death. I think this video is already going to be way longer than I expected it to be. I apologize for that. If you stuck with me, thank you. I hope this gave you some insight. I hope this provided you with something that you can glean, and I hope that maybe some of what's here might still have some critical or interpretive value after Succession ends. Because it'd be great if this video wasn't completely worthless a week and a half from now. Anyway, thank you. If you do by any chance enjoy my thoughts on literature, on Succession, whatever, if you wouldn't mind liking or subscribing. I currently have 2 subscribers, so it wouldn't hurt. Anyway, either way, thank you so much. And yeah, I do intend to go back to talking about the thematic connections between Succession and the Dream Song, so expect that in a future video. Also, maybe, hopefully, expect some videos that have nothing to do with Succession or the Dream Song, and instead are maybe more film, television, or even literary criticism. Anyway, thanks guys, that's it. To hell with it, I'm done.